Welcome to The Pilgrim, the podcast for Jesus followers like you who wants tips and advice to grow their faith in the ups and downs of journeying through this world. I am O.O. Living and I'm your host. There is a favorite statement a brother of mine normally makes. He says, prayer is a fight. I never did like the phrase until I realized that prayer indeed is a fight because the Christian life itself, is a fight. If you're like me, you struggle with knowing how to pray, and if you're among those who trust in the absolute sovereignty of God over everything, you have asked, should I trust that everything is in God's hand and rest knowing He will do the best thing for me? Or should I cry out to God earnestly to change the situation, giving Him reasons to answer my prayer, wrestling with God, or resting in Him, which is far better? Resting seems godlier, trusting that God will give you what you need without even asking. It seems more holy, more faith-filled, more biblical. Resting seems to indicate a more mature faith. But when I look at the Bible, I see a fuller picture of prayer. Jesus tells us to ask and it will be given to us. Matthew 7:7. And that if we remain in Him, we can ask for whatever we wish and it will be done for us. John 15:7. Not only that, Jesus exhorts us to always pray and never give up. That's what we actually dealt with in the last episode. Jesus told the parable of the unjust judge who gave the widow justice because she kept coming to him, and likened that to the way we need to cry out to God. He commended the Canaanite woman for her faith and did what she asked because she was persistent, giving Jesus reasons to answer her. When Jesus spoke about prayer, He told us to bring our requests to God. Wrestling with God is asking Him for what we want. Persisting in prayer, crying out to Him for ourselves and others. There can be no detachment or apathy in wrestling. It involves direct and constant contact. When we wrestle, we believe that our cries and prayers matters. We have hope that our situation will change and we are fully engaged. Throughout the Bible, we see people wrestling with God. Moses wrestled with God, interceding on behalf of the people to change God's mind. He pleaded with God. He gave God reasons to answer his prayer. He reminded God of his promises, and as a result, God often relented to rain down his judgment. Moses was willing to ask God anything, and when the answer was no, Moses rested. Moses deeply trusted God and dared to believe that what he said matters. Pause. Just wait a minute. I want you to know that what you say to God in prayer matters to God. Let that sink in. David also believed that his prayers mattered. He poured out his lament through tears, expecting God to answer. Most of David's psalm of lament melt into praise because through his wrestling, David came to rest and trust in God. When David's child with Bathsheba was ill, David sought God on behalf of the child. He fasted and prayed and lay all night on the ground. But when the child died, David got up, anointed himself, and went to the house of God and worshipped. Habakkuk begins his book asking, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save." Habakkuk 1:2. But after his wrestling, Habakkuk is content to rest in God, declaring, Even though the fig trees have no blossoms, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Habakkuk 3:17-18. We see the Apostle Paul pleading with the Lord to remove the thorn in his flesh 3 times. But then the Lord told him to be contented in his weaknesses so that the power of Christ would rest upon him. Ultimately, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane asking God to remove the cup from him 3 times, sweating drops of blood in his agony. But ultimately, Jesus declares, "Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." Luke 22:42. Indeed, prayer is a fight, but it is not a fight for us to win or lose. Because throughout scriptures we see that wrestling leads to resting, which leads to worship. That's been true in my own life as well. Despairing over a loved one who was raped, I prayed for days with tears, questioning God for allowing it to happen. And then I came to the end of myself. After some days, rather than gloom, I became grateful that God healed my heart rather than answer my question. I fell on my face in worship and gratitude. Yet, there have been there have been times when I wrestled with God, asking him just as persistently and earnestly, but God did not answer. I was heartbroken but kept wrestling with his refusal to answer me, voicing my frustration and disappointment to God. David knew how I felt when he cried, "O Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way?" Psalm 13 verse 1. In cleaving to God, honestly lamenting my pain, I grew closer to God rather than apart from him. I felt his presence. This is also worship. Wrestling in prayer actually brings us closer to God. This is what happened to Jacob when he wrestled with an unknown man until daybreak. This man was clearly stronger than Jacob. He simply touched his hip to put it out of joint. But this stranger knew that wrestling was important for Jacob. Jacob grabbed him, refusing to let the man go until he blessed him. After he was blessed for his persistence, Jacob said, "I have seen God face to face." You can read the story in Genesis 32:22-32. Before anyone get this wrong, this wrestling with God in prayer doesn't mean that we shouldn't rest in him in faith. As we give our burdens to Jesus, he gives us rest. We can cease striving and find rest for our souls. We can find peace and contentment when we are fully satisfied in him, trusting in his care. But sometimes resting can be a cover for resignation because we have given up hope. Sometimes saying that we are trusting is a way of protecting ourselves from disappointment. Sometimes not asking is a sign of drifting from God, unwilling to actively engage him. We need to understand where our resting is coming from. Resting begins with wrestling. So pray bold, daring prayers. Expect God to move. Talk to him consistently. Ask, ask. Pray. Ask, seek, and knock. And when your wrestling is over, you will find an intimacy sweeter than you have ever known. And that wrestling will lead you to truth rest in the one who is worthy of all our worship and praise. Prayer is a fight. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you find it helpful, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast or search our growing archive for more talks on the Christian life. I remain your host, O.O. Living. See you next time.